Town Hall, a conversation about jobs and the economy, is made possible with the support of AARP Indiana and by the following.
Good evening and welcome to a town hall meeting with U.S. Senator Mike Braun. I'm Jim Shella. This event is a production of WFYI and Indiana Town Halls, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization created to increase citizen access to members of Congress. For more about our organization and our sponsors, you can go to our website at indianatownhalls.org. Due to COVID concerns, this is a virtual town hall. Questions will come from a diverse panel of voters selected from across the state. We intend to focus this discussion on issues related to jobs and the economy. Senator Braun was scheduled to be here in studio, but because of votes taking place in the Senate, he is in Washington, D.C. and joins us via satellite. Senator, thank you for this opportunity. Would you like to make a brief opening statement?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Jim. We are in the midst of getting through a series of votes this evening, and I think I'll be able to make it through the entirety of the hour we have scheduled or close to it. I've been here in the Senate a little under 3 years. Generally draw on the experience I gained by running a Main Street enterprise for 37 years prior to becoming a senator. Draw on that experience. I'm on the Agriculture Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the Budget Committee, which we're wrestling with that issue right now. We need to do a lot better. We do it well in Indiana. We live within our means, have a balanced budget amendment, do actual budgeting processes. We've really gotten away from all that out here, and that's part of why we run trillion-dollar deficits annually. So that's an area where I've been an outspoken critic of fixing the system because so many people look to it. I've been outspoken on reforming health care. Many Republicans don't like to talk about that. To me, in my own business, that was the biggest challenge, giving affordable, good health care coverage for my employees. And I did that 13 years ago and have been able to hold premiums nearly flat for that period of time and have not had my employees paying any more. They're into their own wellness. They're doing things that I think we could do here at the national level. So that was the first Republican to join in on the conversation on climate, got 6 others to do it. So I'm interested in being a Republican that embraces the issues of the day and comes up with sustainable, affordable solutions, not being a party of no or I'm not interested. That's what I intend to do while I'm here in the Senate.
Thanks very much, Senator. We're going to go to questions now from our panel. The first question will come from Noelle Snyder. She belongs to an organization called Indiana Women for Change. Go ahead, Noelle.
Hi there. So my first question today is, how can Hoosiers work together to lower the gender pay gap of 24%? That ranks us 44th in the country. So I wanted to know how we could all work together to lower that.
It's a good question. That's a gap that is way too large. One of my 2 daughters works in my business, and I think that should be a goal of any CEO of a larger business, even if you own a smaller business on Main Street. And that should not be an issue. Can we solve that through government? I think if you try to do it, I would think that the state government might be a more effective place to put policy into action that would try to encourage narrowing that gap. It's been talked about a lot at the federal level. That is way too high. There's no reason it should be there, period. Anyone's pay should be based upon his or her merit, not your sex. So that's something that what policy we'd come up with, I'd rather see it done at the state level. It'd get done more quickly and probably more effectively, and that's way too large a gap.
All right, our next question comes from Larry Kane. Larry is a retired environmental attorney. Go ahead.
Senator Braun, the economy and climate change are closely related, given that adverse impacts of climate change carry hefty price tags. Will you support expansion of the renewable energy sector through investments such as a modernized electric transmission grid and creation of a carbon tax via the pending infrastructure bills?
So when it comes to, first of all, I told you earlier, I started the Climate Caucus here to where at least we on the conservative side are in the conversation. When it comes to investment tax credits or anything that we spend through the federal government, it'd be a lot easier equation if we were doing it from a position of strength and not to where we're borrowing $1 trillion a year on the normal stuff that we do. That's no excuse for not being involved in the conversation, but it's going to make it hard when we try to fix things like healthcare or climate, lower the cost of education if you're trying to weigh in at the federal level and you're doing it from a position of weakness. So I've made it very clear that I want to be engaged in the issues, but I want to do it to where we have honest pay-fors, that we don't borrow money from future generations. That's the way to do it and have it done sustainably.
Our next question comes from Ellen Zarletta. Ellen is a professor at Indiana University Northwest. Go ahead, Ellen.
Good evening, Senator. There's a significant concern that the current economic transformation that's resulting from technology advances such as AI and robots will negatively impact the labor market and won't build on the nation's key asset. How does the U.S. government work with business and other sectors to ensure that the adoption of the new forms of technology supports economic growth and supports a vibrant democracy?
It's a good question. I think AI and a lot of technology is going to become increasingly more in the equation. Currently, our issue is we don't have enough qualified workers to fill the jobs that we've got. And a lot of that, I think, has been actually caused by some misguided government policy. We're lucky in a state like Indiana that pre-COVID, we were the peer leader in low unemployment across the Midwest. But I've been an outspoken critic there that we got to make sure in our high school educations that we do more things to get people skills coming out of high school for the high demand, high wage jobs that currently exist. Don't guide only into a 4-year degree where half the people that pursue it don't make the finish line, and a third to get a degree have a degree where there's no market for it. So I think that's something to be concerned about in the long run. I'm more concerned about filling the jobs that we're having trouble filling currently.
The next question comes from Elizabeth Benyon. She is also a professor. She is at Indiana University South Bend. Elizabeth is also a member of the Indiana Debate Commission. Your question, please.
I will follow up on Larry Kane's question to ask you about the fact that Indiana manufactures a variety of petroleum and coal products. How important to the state and national economy are such products, and should Indiana and other states seek to move away from these products as part of their environmental stewardship and economic growth efforts in the future?
So any business, in my observation, utilities have already made a pretty strong statement that they're moving from coal to natural gas. We've got a very vibrant solar and wind power investment here in the state. It is very clear in my mind, the cleanest, least expensive fuel needs to carry the day in the long run. And that could even be things like advanced nuclear technology, where our own Purdue University has done some things to make that more doable. So I think in the future, climate is being felt in places like farming and agriculture. Actually got a bill through that I authored, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that doesn't address fossil fuels, but it at least gets into the equation of what do we do in a bipartisan way. If you're heavily invested in fossil fuels, even speaking to people like the chair of ExxonMobil, they know in the long run that they've got to make that change. Do we pull the rug out from underneath industries when China's still putting up a coal-fired plant weekly? That's where we got to be careful. A little trickier in terms of how we get there. In the long run, the cleanest, least expensive fuel will carry the day.
Our next question comes from a student at Indiana University South Bend. His name is Christian Martinez. Go ahead, Christian.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer intend on passing legislation to suspend the debt limit through the end of the year, a proposal which Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell opposes. Where do you stand on the issue of raising the debt limit, and do you see any potential economic consequences from the U.S. government defaulting on its debt if the debt ceiling is not raised?
A great question, because that's the currency of where we're at right now. And two things. This has been a joint venture between Republicans and Democrats, where it's been kind of an unholy alliance. Defense is probably the most important thing we do here at the federal government. Shoring up entitlements ought to be one of them. They're the big drivers of our $1 trillion deficits currently. And infrastructure, ironically, which is a bill that's passed through the Senate, did have bipartisan support. We're wrestling with the so-called soft infrastructure. So when it comes to these peculiarities you see nowhere else, where we don't budget, both parties are to blame. This is a little different in this case. This debt ceiling request is on top of $6.5 trillion in spending that has been teed up where no Republican voted for any of it. And part of the debt ceiling being either suspended or increased, it's increasing it is a little tougher because you got to pick a figure that's more excruciating, has to do with spending that we just simply can't afford because we'll be borrowing too much of the money to do it anyway. That'll even cause us to increase that limit even higher. So clear, it's been a joint venture getting here. What we're doing to ask to suspend it or lift it currently, to me, is beyond the pale. We'll get through it. I don't think there'll be any type of default. There never has been. That's a lot of what you hear. I think to threaten politicians to get their job done correctly, and it's sad that we get to this point in the first place.
Just to be clear, Senator, you will vote against increasing the debt ceiling, is that right?
Well, and and I think every Republican will, because the Democrats can do it within their own tools because they control both chambers and the presidency.
All right, the next question comes from John Hooker. He's the president of the Central Indiana Building and Construction Trades Council. Go ahead.
Good evening, Senator. The pandemic has everyone evaluating their career paths. What would you suggest as our K through 12 system to do a better guide aspiring students into career paths other than college? More specifically, registered apprenticeships and other work-based learning opportunities.
That's a great question, and unions have probably led the way on apprenticeships. I've visited several where they do that, and they do it well. Businesses finally are doing a lot of that on their own. Toyota has got an excellent program going, but here's where we need to do it better. When I was in high school, I took industrial arts, probably the one course I remember the most about. We had metal and wood shop. You could learn to weld. These are all skills that in many times pay more than a four-year degree will pay. When I was in the state legislature, brought this up on the education committee, and they didn't like the sound of it because they thought that meant that you had to take kids away from looking at a four-year pathway. We need to have better high school courses so that when you get out of high school, you got better options and where you're not guided into only a four-year degree pathway.
Thank you, Senator. We'll give you a break there to take a drink of water. I know there's a lot of talking going on behind the scenes in Washington today, I'm sure, and we're not helping out with the situation. But next question comes from Vicki Small. She is an AARP volunteer. Go ahead, Vicki.
Good evening, Senator. You know, Americans pay 3 times more than other countries for the same brand prescription drugs. What can be done to lower prescription drug prices for Hoosiers?
That is sad, and there are a lot of bills out there, and I believe the way you lower prices in general, hospitals, pharma, practitioners, insurance, is through transparency, and competition. In the meantime, the healthcare industry kind of operates like an unregulated utility. And where most Hoosiers, most Americans run into it would be in the cost of their prescriptions. So I tell the industry all the time, either get with it to where you give us prices that are more affordable through competition and transparency, or you're going to have government weigh in and do benchline pricing. So that remains to be seen to where we're going to end up.
Our next question comes from Linda Dunno. She is also with AARP. She is the state president, and she's calling in from Fort Wayne. Go ahead, Linda.
Good evening, Senator. America's long-term care system is made up of more than 48 million family caregivers, whom on average spend over $7,200 in out-of-pocket costs on caregiving needs annually. What solutions would you like to see implemented to better support caregivers, the backbone of America's caring economy?
So that was all really put to test going through COVID. And I think it's shown a lot of places within our healthcare system that we need to shore it up. Sadly, I hear caregivers, practitioners are caught in the swirl of wanting to do it and don't have the pay, or it doesn't work out to where it makes it worthwhile for them to do it. A lot of that has to do with the fact that every aspect of healthcare has gotten increasingly more concentrated among fewer companies. So it's not going to be an easy solution. There'll be more government involvement and regulation along the way, and caregivers are at the forefront. A lot of that can be done obviously more efficiently and reasonably in the home in many cases. When you go in to visit the healthcare system, it's got to be made easier. Telehealth will be part of that, and we'll just have to see where it goes. Sadly, it's really shown the light on a lot of the weaknesses that were in the system pre-COVID, and we're going to work our way through it, and it's a good question.
Our next question comes from Ken Paust. He is a Wayne County Commissioner. Go ahead, Mr. Paust.
Hi, good evening, Senator. Good infrastructure investment leads to jobs and economic development. When Indiana approved their new infrastructure plan in 2017, it was funded through increases in the fuel tax and the registration fee. It included an automatic gas tax increase each year to keep up with inflation. What is the reluctance in Congress to create a similar long-term funding plan for the traditional infrastructure of bridges and roads? We have 223 bridges in the county that I represent, and funding is always under consideration.
Good question, because I was in the legislature back when we did that, was proud to be a co-author of that bill. Chairman Ed Soliday led that through the Roads and Transportation Committee. We've got the federal gas tax that we haven't increased since 1993. And we've got it there, we just don't have the will and backbone. And what we've been doing is borrowing money out of the general fund. So we need to do what we did back in Indiana, pay for it in an honest way, and make sure we spend it on roads and bridges.
The next question comes from Allison Stewart. She is a student at Vincennes University. Go ahead. We're having trouble getting Allison? Let's move on to the next question. The next one will come from Mikey Karachi, a student at Indiana University Northwest. Is Mikey there?
Good evening, Senator.
Good evening.
Hoosiers limited to the minimum wage job market receive around $14,000 in income each year, but the average annual budget of a Hoosier household is around $35,000 to $40,000 a year. How is Congress working to address this inadequate wage at the federal level, and how will you work in Hoosiers' best interest to address this issue?
So the minimum wage, when you do extend it into what that would be annually, there's no way you can make a living on that. Generally, the minimum wage is going to be for entry-level jobs, training, a lot of places where you don't expect to do that as your career. It also has to be probably differentiated on your cost of living. I don't know how anybody could live in New York on $15 an hour. You could probably do that in a place like Indiana. And wherever your minimum wage ends up, to me, it still needs to be more a function of the states doing it. And if states have a minimum wage which is too low, you're going to find people will decide in the long run to maybe do something else. But it needs to be considered along with your cost of living. And I think that a national minimum wage that would be too high would hurt certain states that have a lower cost of living. I would be for raising it in a way that reflected that difference. I think it's going to be a moot point currently because look at the demand for labor and it's way up, and hardly any job that I see advertised out there is paying less than 15 bucks currently.
Our next question comes from Kathy Gross. She is the mayor of Monticello, Indiana. Go ahead, Mayor. We having apparently she is not in front of her computer, so we're going to move on to Kevin Brinegar. Kevin is the president of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, Kevin.
In the Indiana Chamber's recent statewide employer survey, nearly 3/4 of employers said that the supply of employees does not meet their needs. Obviously, that's very concerning for future economic development. To close this gap, one answer could be through immigration reform. How would you revamp the various immigration processes to greater allow for legal hiring of both lower skilled workers and highly educated individuals from other countries?
So number one, I think, Kevin, that's going to depend on having a secure border, because if we don't have that, we politically will not get to the hard work that needs to be done to address exactly what you've talked about. That was working pre-COVID and then pre-Biden on the border. It wasn't a grassroots solution. That has a lot to do with how economies do better in the Northern Triangle, in South America, in Mexico. But in general, until we get the southern border fixed, I don't think we'll get to that. Let's say we do. Then I think you need to look at immigration. We average about 1 million a year. We're the most welcoming country in the world. It needs to be done on who we need, on merit, on specific job shortages to where you have special work visas that get you into the country to address it, make that easier, less red tape. Our office does a lot of casework on visas currently that have had trouble because of the COVID restrictions. Get all of that out of the way, because I think you're 100% right. We don't have enough people here that'll fill the jobs. You get into agriculture, and even if you pay in the mid-20s, you can't get help on places like dairy farms. But I think before we get there, realistically, it's got to be based upon having a border security that makes sure that it is working. Then I think you'll see solutions cascade to fix the immigration issue.
If I could just follow up, Senator, how do you create effective border security? Do you have a proposal?
When we were down there, 18 to 19 of us back in March, it was very clear, the Border Patrol, this is getting it from them, said that the wall in high traffic areas made sense. It's a shame you need a wall, but when people come across illegally like they've done for decades and don't pay attention to it, I don't think you're going to get the border security that'll be satisfactory across the political spectrum. And then the other policy that was working is we were working with our most important southern border partner, Mexico, the Stay in Mexico policy. So that sadly got caught up in the hot politics. It was working. That doesn't mean it's the long-term solution, but we need to do whatever we can through technology, physical impediments, and getting our trading partners to work with us to make sure that they're not flaunting the border and that it's truly secure.
Sending Haitian immigrants back to Haiti, was that the right thing to do?
Well, whenever you've got an issue there where they've been beset by all the problems they've got, that should be done in an orderly fashion through the refugee category of how people come into this country. They're coming in the way they did, probably encouraged by coyotes and smugglers along the way. Most of them have to pay a fee to get here. That's not right either. So those are the complications you're going to run into when you've kicked the can down the road and you don't have an inherently secure border to begin with.
All right, our next question comes from Eunice Trotter. She is a journalist and author from Indianapolis. Go ahead.
Hello, Senator. People are hurting financially right now. So to afford an apartment in Indiana at $862 a month, a renter should earn $16.57 an hour, yet the average renter's wage in this state is $14.58 an hour. In your opinion, sir, what is a livable income for a family of four in Indiana? What do you recommend be done to boost Indiana's ranking among states in terms of wage growth? We're at 46, especially in the non-union service industry.
You got a good point. You can't live a life to even pay your rent unless you've got enough income there. You cited the statistic. That's something with all the good things we have in terms of Indiana having a good job climate, we've got to aspire to do better on the wages. And that's going to be a function of having businesses that pay higher wages move into the state due to the business climate. But I've been a loud voice from the time I was awarded Entrepreneur of the Year down in Du Bois County, the lowest unemployment county, and one of the highest entry wage counties with a low cost of living. I said that's important. Wages and having employees to fill your slots, you're not going to grow your business without it. So that's something where we got to work on it through any education tools that we got from the high school level through post-secondary, and it's something that we need to do better at.
Our next question comes from Stephanie Terry. She is from Evansville. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you. Income inequality and the wealth gap is staggering for African Americans. The net worth of a white family is 10 times greater than a black family. Senator Braun, what policy solutions or legislation do you support to address wealth disparities?
Again, income inequality is something until the conservative side of the ledger and Republicans are in on the discussion. I think it's going to be a void that we'd have to explain why we're not there. Pre-COVID, wages for the toughest places, African Americans especially, were going up. And some of those tools were working that was getting industry to compete for wages, which is the way the free market system should work. Ideally, it's not substituted through government to try to do it. That's never going to be sustainable and work in the long run. And that's going to be based upon a robust economy where we've got more demand for labor than what we have people to fill it, and you raise the wages doing it. It was happening pre-COVID. There's been some discussion, well, maybe we can do it through government. And I think the government through COVID has created an issue where it's tough to get people back to work. And most of all this discussion about wage rates and jobs, there's never been a healthier environment right now with offers for high pay. And hopefully, people will come back to work and take advantage of it. And if we're still hurting in those areas statistically, we as a state, we as a country need to figure out why, but it's got to be based upon a robust economy, not government doing it, because that's not going to work in the long run.
All right, we've reached the halfway point in our town hall meeting, and I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that this is a production of WFYI and Indiana Town Halls, a nonprofit organization that seeks to promote civil discussion with members of Congress about important issues facing America. Please go to our website at indianatownhalls.org and take the survey regarding tonight's event. Our next question comes from Allie Nickerson. She is a student at the University of Indianapolis.
Senator, you've expressed commitment to increasing economic opportunity for all Hoosiers, but you refused to support the American Rescue Plan, which gave $5.8 billion to Indiana and provided stimulus checks to 91% of Hoosiers. How do you propose we increase opportunity without providing workers the support they need to recover?
It's a good question. However, all of that was done through government and not where, if you want this to work and be there in the long run, it's got to be done and energized, I think, through the state and local governments. And to address some of the valid questions that have been brought up today, not putting more government spending where we're borrowing the money out here to do it. That is just not a business plan that's going to work in the long run. And for states that are not providing the proper educational framework and not doing things in a way that put them in a place to have their citizens have good paying jobs, keeping cost of living low, there's always going to be that desire, that tendency to look to government to do it. And I just don't believe that's a good long-term solution. And I think the rescue bill, a lot of the stuff in there is policy that should be probably discussed. We shouldn't have borrowed $1.9 trillion to do it, because that won't be a source of funding that'll be there in the long run that is sustainable.
Our next question comes from Isra Halder, a student at the IU McKinney School of Law. Go ahead.
In Indiana, only 7.5% of people age 18 to 24 have a good paying job. Many students are very concerned about paying off student loan debt, securing good jobs, and having an economically prosperous future. My question for you is, what steps is Congress taking to improve the economic state of young people in Indiana and in the country?
Good question, and I think that you probably need to look to see how that can be done sustainably by what was happening pre-COVID. I've been on the street trying to run a business for 37 years prior to becoming a senator. We pay the highest starting wage and the lowest unemployment county generally in the state. And what you're saying is not true everywhere. It's going to be that way maybe in certain places across our state. And it's a big question of whether you want to try to artificially force that through government in some fashion. I just don't think that's going to work. On the other hand, in places like Indiana, if you need to do better at it, and there have been some statistics brought out to where we do need to improve, we ought to craft those solutions at the state and local area, not the federal government, because I think it would work better. And I would take some exception with the fact that too many people look to the federal government to backfill. It's just never done a good long-term job from the days of the Great Society to pay for it in a sustainable way. And certain states, including Indiana, I think, even though there's areas that need to be improved, offer opportunities. And it's a question for us to work out, not the feds coming in and doing it for us.
Our next question comes from a farmer, Mike Beard. He is also affiliated with the Indiana Corn Growers Association. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Senator Braun, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to talk with you about the carbon markets and what they might mean for Hoosier farmers. It could be a huge benefit to the Hoosier economy for farmers to develop an ancillary revenue stream through carbon credit markets. But many of us who were early adopters of climate smart practices are likely to lose out on this market. Do you see a way for farmers who have engaged in these practices for years to meaningfully participate in the market? And do you think our lack of participation, if we're not able to access the market, will undermine our national climate goals and put Indiana agriculture at a disadvantage?
Well, good question, because I thought so much about that being the case that I introduced the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And believe it or not, a climate bill that was a result of the climate caucus I started, got 6 other Republicans to get on board, and no one was willing to do it until I said yes in the middle of my first year in the Senate. We actually passed 92-8, a bill that would do exactly what you're talking about. It's over in the House right now, and I think that it's got a good shot of getting through there. That is almost a modern miracle in this day and age for how long it takes legislation to get through. Your stewardship on the farm and being rewarded for it is an excellent place to start. I think that farmers are probably on the front edge of dealing with how this is really working in their own small businesses. And farming isn't such a small business anymore. It's gotten to be very complicated with a lot of acres to boot, a lot riskier than what it used to be. So hopefully this will get through in the House, and agriculture will lead the way, get transportation, get electric generation, and industrial emitters to start doing the same thing. I was proud to be the author of that bill. Hopefully it'll make it across the finish line, get signed by the president into law. That'll be the first climate bill that actually gets through the U.S. Senate and the House and becomes a law.
Yesenia Tostado has our next question. She is with Project Azul. Go ahead.
Good evening, Senator. The COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacted Latino and Black-owned businesses. The CARES Act created some resources and reforms specifically designed to assist these businesses with a varying degree of effectiveness. How do you assess these measures, and how will you prioritize and ensure that minority-owned businesses have equitable access to these resources to survive beyond the pandemic?
A good question, and I'd love to hear. Another part of being a senator is you have constituent services, and in any of the applications for the disposition of those funds should be getting across the spectrum, regardless of what ethnicity you have. And for any business, especially a minority-owned business, which we know sometimes has maybe a tougher time of getting started, making it across the finish line. 9 out of 10 businesses don't make it past 5 years into their 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th year of being in business. So I would hope that there aren't any issues there in terms of accessing those funds when they were available. And if there's anything done down the road, whether it's through some type of special emergency relief or other things that happen in the government, we need to be made aware of it. And hopefully that's not happening and is not an issue. If it is, re-engage with my office. I'd like to hear more.
Greg Wathen has our next question. He is the president of the Evansville Regional Economic Partnership. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. What we find, not unlike many regions in Indiana, the need for talent has markedly increased over the past 10 to 12 months. With all the various financial economic measures that the current administration have put in place, such as extended unemployment benefits or increased child tax credits, we find ourselves with the public sector competing with the private sector for talent. How do we get those people who are on the sidelines to come back into the workforce?
You know, Greg, that's a good question, because public policy, sometimes we went to town and did things quickly, like with the PPP, other stuff, $4 trillion worth of stuff back in 2020. And then when you look at extended unemployment benefits and some other things that were out there, I wonder if the public policy was on the mark, because sooner or later, the productive economy, meaning the real economy, has got to be back where people are spending their time. And you cannot expect a paycheck from the government to be able to support you other than in extraordinary situations. And the programs that we've already got in place to do it aren't in all cases hitting the mark. So I'm hoping that with those benefits not being there, with businesses raising wages all the time, that we get people back into the workforce. But that's one of the tricky, challenging things, is when you have a change in the way things are normally done, if you incentivize it in a way that might continue people to stay on the sidelines and not come back to work. It's playing out in front of us right now. I hear it everywhere, and other senators are hearing it across the country. Hopefully, when we get COVID fully at bay, and it looks like the variant numbers are coming way down, people will have a reason to get back because they don't feel that they're risking coming back to work, and there aren't misguided government policies that might be incentivizing you not to come back.
Our next question is from Alicia Modisette Kemp. She is president of the Lugar Series.
Good evening. The pandemic has disproportionately impacted women in the workforce. Women have dropped out of the labor force at a rate 4 times higher than men, mostly due to child care giving needs. What can Congress do to ensure that women can recapture the gains that we were seeing in the workplace before the pandemic began?
I think you make a good point. You were making a lot of headway pre-COVID, and I think we need to go back to see what was working there. And that wasn't involving a large government presence then. That had a lot to do with an economy that I think had the sweet spot of taxation. You had Main Street entrepreneurs, small businesses, all the way up to big companies working, raising wages. And I would hope that it doesn't mean that we want more government to come into play to do some of the things you've been talking about. Childcare is a real issue. It got thrown completely out of kilter with COVID. Many people felt uncomfortable going back to work and didn't have a daycare center to go to. That is where we may need to look at some of the things we're doing currently that is erring too much on the side of not letting us get back to where we were before, because that was a model of where things were working, wages were going up, business was good, COVID came in, interrupted. We got to make sure that we don't have policies that linger, that keep us in a place that where it's not working.
Tamara Harris has our next question. She is affiliated with Hoosier Action. Go ahead, Tamara.
Hi, good evening. Across Indiana, working parents are struggling to find quality childcare they can afford for their families. Before the pandemic, many were made for the childcare to close. And we're just trying to find out, what would you do to help us to ensure that the childcare is both affordable for families and to assure that childcare providers are making a living wage that is suitable for being able to survive?
Good question. It was similar to the one before. And here's what I would say. Increasingly, when it comes to like job training, I see businesses starting their own apprenticeships to address that issue. I think that's going to be fair play for a lot of businesses to do. And I think it would be done in probably a more easily implementable way, in a way that may be there, not dependent on a government program at the federal level. And if you're going to address it to where government needs to be involved, I would strongly encourage you to get with your state legislators and see what they've got in mind. You got to remember, anything that comes from here has got a shaky long-term presence because of how poorly we run the place. And I know people look to the federal government because they've got real issues and frustrations. I just would strongly advise, from the time I've spent here, don't rule out what you can do in your own communities. Businesses need to be challenged because a lot of this has to do with their own workers, to where they get involved, spend some money on daycare and childcare, reinvest in higher wages for your employees so they can afford to find childcare that might be difficult to find currently. I wouldn't look to the federal government to solve it. I think it's a false hope, and it would not end up being sustainable. Good question.
Samantha Kern has our next question. She is from Fishers. Go ahead, Samantha.
Good evening, Senator. Indiana has some of the worst rates of maternal and infant mortality and preterm birth rates in the country. One of the reasons why is because Indiana fails to provide protections and reasonable accommodations to pregnant workers. As a result, Hoosier moms like myself have been forced between choosing to put food on the table and the health of their pregnancies. In my case, a lack of accommodations resulted in the loss of a child. Will you join the majority of Hoosier delegation and support the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, a bill supported by both business groups and families, and which would provide legal clarity and ensure the safety of Hoosier workers?
And I'm assuming that is a bill at the federal level and not the state level, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we will certainly take a look at that bill, because that is a statistic, along with a few others that we've heard today, that should be the catalyst for the collective effort of businesses and state government to make sure that we are addressing it. If this is a bill at the federal level, we'll certainly take a look at it. You said most of the rest of the delegation is supporting it. I'll take that into consideration, and we'll take a look at that next week. So I'm glad you brought it to my attention. I'll see where it's at.
Randy Shelton of Columbus has our next question, and he's affiliated with Hoosier Action. Go ahead. Looks like we've lost. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. Mary McCloskey, also with Hoosier Action. She's in New Albany. Go ahead, Mary.
Hi. I started a Facebook group at the beginning of the pandemic, which has now helped over 9,700 Hoosiers navigate the unemployment system. I had to research state laws and procedures to navigate our social safety net as a single mother with 2 kids. Food stamps, welfare, and other programs kept my family fed and sustained other Hoosiers throughout the pandemic. But many people don't know programs exist. When people do find them, they are incredibly confusing and hard to navigate. Would you support having local Hoosier navigators or social media pages to increase access to these programs?
It's like a common sense solution in terms of providing more information to that are out there in existing programs. You're touting them as working, and yes, whatever can be done to get the word out, the message out that they are there. It sounds like it helped you, and I'm sure there are others in need as well. So that would be something that I'll try to put some attention to, even though it sounds like it would be mostly done at the state level, and see what could be done to get better information out there for people that are in need of it.
Senator, she mentioned Facebook, and there's been a lot of talk this week about the potential federal regulation of social media platforms, including Facebook. Would you be in favor of federal regulation on social media?
Tell you what, Facebook and the tech industry in general, I come from Main Street, where you've got a lot of options, a lot of competition, a lot of transparency. It's the biggest business in the world currently. It's information and tech. And I'm not happy whenever you have one entity that comprises over 50% of a market. In this case, it's closer to 70 and 80% in many cases. So I think tech is going to have a broad spectrum of federal legislators looking at antitrust issues where they're simply too big for markets. There's not competition that keeps them in check. And then when you've got issues of misinformation, censorship, and other items, that's most likely going to come along with that concentration of power. So I don't know how that's going to get resolved. I do know that it is going to get confronted from several angles. One, from the antitrust discussion, that you simply need more than one company dominating a business. That doesn't work anywhere else, and you can't do that. And then your behavior and your function is going to probably be looked at as well. They're also immune from any liability through the 230 clause. I think that might change as well.
So are you willing to consider federal regulation?
Sure I am.
Okay.
Because when you're not dealing in the context of full competition, transparency, no barriers to entry, and many competitors, you're not really in the realm of free enterprise. Most of us are. They're an example of where it's not.
Mike Kaler is a farmer. He's also with the Indiana Soybean Alliance. He has our next question.
Good evening, Senator Braun. One of the most important components of farming is getting our products to market as quickly and cheaply as possible. And Congress has been working on a bipartisan infrastructure legislating, but the bill gives few dollars to ports and inland waterways in these areas and funds a lot of things that aren't traditional infrastructure at all. We've done the bare minimum of maintenance on the waterways and infrastructures. And why aren't we investing in the maintenance and development of our inland waterways and ports that export millions of tons of grain each year and generate billions of dollars of economic value?
Good question. It begs the question when you're talking about infrastructure and only 10% of it would be roads and bridges. And inland waterways and waterways in general actually pay for more of their usage than almost any other form of logistics. I'm familiar with the funding mechanism. That's one of the tug-of-wars we have here. And if even the hard infrastructure bill was more aligned with what we all understand, which would be roads and bridges, inland waterways, airlines, and railroads. Let's bring in rural broadband, maybe water and sewer treatment plants. And sadly, in that 1.2 trillion, we're not spending enough on places that have gone begging for years. In inland waterways, through our locks and dams, there's more freight that moves there than most people can imagine. It doesn't have much of the consumer transit, of course, so sometimes gets overlooked, but I'm going to be for any type of hard infrastructure, especially with honest pay-fors, and that part has never been shy about, I think, paying close to a 50% user fee currently to pay into it. That's a good match. We need to do better at it. That's one of the reasons I wasn't thrilled about the constitution of that 1.2 trillion bill, for the very reason you mentioned.
Cara Veal has our next questions. She is with the Indiana Rural Health Association. Go ahead.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for being with us this evening. You're likely aware that the rural hospital closure crisis has been of significant concern for about a decade now. What solutions or suggestions can you make to Congress to support the sustainability and viability of rural hospitals across the country?
It's a good question because it has been an area of difficulty. I'm probably the most outspoken senator on either side of the aisle on trying to fix healthcare from the bottom up. On the one hand, you cite what you've just said, and we've got hospital costs, probably not rural hospital costs necessarily, some of the highest in the country here in Indiana. So I don't know that we get to a long-term solution on healthcare unless it's going to be a one-payer system. Most don't want to go there. We don't do that great a job with the part the government does already with healthcare. But it's going to involve things like full transparency, full competition. Don't create barriers to entry for places that want to put a hospital in through a certificate of need, all that kind of stuff. And in the meantime, I think you'd probably have to again look to state government to make sure that in the process of getting to a solution that works for Indiana, for Hoosiers, that we don't lose too many rural hospitals along the way. And it again looks like hospitals are becoming more and more concentrated among fewer and fewer companies. I don't like that either. So you've got a lot of moving parts to get to a sustainable healthcare system, and we've evolved in a way over many, many years where it's not working, and where we end up with a solution remains to be seen. It's still the #1 issue in D.C.
All right, I think this will be our last question. It comes from Diana Biddle. She is a Brown County Commissioner. Go ahead, Commissioner. No? We're going to move on to Denise Abdul Rahman from the NAACP. Go ahead, Denise.
Good evening, Senator Braun. There are grid failures in Texas and Louisiana and Now more than ever, decentralized energy, clean energy is more important than ever. A report today by the local Solar for All reports that distributed solar and storage is critical to climate and equity solutions, such as 1.2 million solar jobs by 2030. These are good paying jobs for urban and rural alike. How important is solar to you? And net metering is about to expire in Indiana. What is your support for Section 25D of the direct pay option for low-income family solar buyers, and your position on solar tax credits for non-for-profits? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And solar needs to be one of 4 or 5 things in the mix, especially for Hoosier energy specifically. It's clear, I think we're transitioning away from coal. That affects mostly where I'm from, the southwestern part of the state. That even needs to be still a viable alternative if you can really sequester carbon in an affordable way. So I'm for all areas being enabled. When you do use tax credits, you do create an uneven playing field to some extent. Sooner or later, you need to be weaned from them. And I think that as we go down the road, as I said earlier, when a question was brought up on what is going to be the sustainable source of fuel, it's going to be the least expensive and cleanest. It could be something like advanced nuclear technology that won't even be out there on a scalable basis for 15 to 20 years. Could be hydrogen fuel cells. If batteries become more effective, more efficient, solar is going to become increasingly important. Wind and solar will probably only go so far in Indiana because it's not baseload contributors to the grid. You mentioned net metering. Anybody that invests in solar panels in their own home, they should be paid for any excess energy they put back into the grid. And I think the bill that we had in place might have been from when I was in there, and I think that needs to remain in place. And I think you got to be cognizant that there are other issues like the grid capacity itself. Visited a wind farm, and they couldn't put up their most recent wind turbine because there wasn't transmission capability there in northwestern Indiana. So we got a lot of issues there, but I think that idea of having clean fuel that is produced at the least expensive level will win the day, and I'm going to be for that.
Senator, we're running out of time. We'll give you about 20 seconds for any closing thoughts you'd like to share.
Well, it's a great conversation, and I want to tell you this. I didn't tell you in the intro. Any Hoosier can visit me in Jasper on a Friday, and we can take up to an hour to get in the weeds on a topic. And I'd be happy with anyone here to continue the conversation with a phone call or a Zoom call. I'm here to represent you, and I want to be accessible, and I thought it was a great conversation this evening.
Thank you. We appreciate your time, Senator Braun. This has been a production of WFYI and Indiana Town Halls. For more on our organization and sponsors, and to fill out a survey about this town hall, go to indianatownhalls.org. We plan to present more programs of this sort in the future. I'm Jim Shella. Good night.